in Japan, how do the lifestyle affect their gameplay? Because I know that in Japan, work is really, really harsh. People go home
Mhm.
really late at night. How would they find time to play at all? It takes a really long commitment. Yeah.
Having said that, there are of course the people that go to the salaried jobs and just give up all their hobbies and live this kind of disgusting straight to the grave lifestyle. Luckily, that's no longer a big thing anymore, and the millennials and other, I guess, people my age have long since realized, it's worth having a hobby or two. So a lot of people will pick up a hobby or two, and if role playing is one of those hobbies, they'll dedicate the time to it. Having said that, though, in the U.S., I had some really dedicated. Like when I lived in the U.S. for 15 years before coming back to Japan, and I had a regular game group that we would meet once every week or once every other week and stuff like that, for a couple hours a night. And it was after work, so everyone could show up and grab some dinner and together and eat and play for a few hours on a weeknight. The weeknight stuff is not as big in Japan because the weeknights tend to run a little bit longer, um, especially in the Tokyo area where people can live apart, um, and everyone's jobs are apart. To organize and stuff like that can take a little bit longer. People still do it, especially at game cafes, which are kind of a newer phenomenon. Is one of the places to meet. But rather than meeting like weekly or biweekly, a lot of people I know that are in campaigns, they'll do the 4 to 5 hour adventure session here and there. Maybe one on a weeknight or mostly on the weekends, honestly. But for the most part, a lot of the games that I've seen and been involved in have been sort of a one session per month or one session every 3 weeks sort of thing. So not as what aggressive and not like as weekly and stuff like that as we saw like a traditional like the U.S. Uh, market. It usually tends to be once every 3 or 4 weeks, and finding a place to play can be a challenge. In Tokyo, a lot of people will go to a game cafe or a comfortable like a rent out a space in a restaurant or a tavern, or alternately go to a cheap karaoke place. Pay the karaoke fee, but just sit in there and be in a quiet room and do Dungeons and Dragons or Call of Cthulhu or something.
I think they have their own game shop there, right? But do game shop provide places to play?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So the game shop that has a few tables has been around, but honestly, with spaces at a premium, and I'm talking mostly about Tokyo here, and Osaka, I should say, place like the stores, they might have a table or two, but honestly, they're not really meant to play. They just don't have the space, they don't have the time. But what's been bubbling up is game cafes, especially, and I've been a really strong member of the longest running one, the most successful one in Japan, which is Cafe Daydream, which is actually the cafe that's managed, run by Atsuhiro Okada, the author of Ryutama. He runs that cafe. Um, but there's been a lot of recently, especially with board games, the board game explosions happening here in Japan. There's a lot of what they call tabletop cafes. Many board game focused, but RPG as well, where you come in and you spend a little money, a little bit less than you would pay to rent out a karaoke box room, karaoke room. Um, and you sit there with your friends in a room, and there'd be like other tables here and there where people are gaming, and you get snacks and stuff like that, and you play in an open space. It's kind of like the environment is going to vary shop to shop, but if you consider it like it's kind of like a library, but with bookshelf instead of bookshelves, it's like game shelves, and yeah, and you can schedule games in advance or just show up and play as you see fit.
It's not too far off sometimes, with how it is in Melbourne, because usually the CBD area it's really busy. It's hard to get
Mhm.
places, and I think organizing RPG has been like a recurring problem in any part of the world, to be honest. Even in Australia, even though there are such a big space, but at least because over here. people's living space is a bit larger than Japan. I guess it's easier to
Yeah.
organize a game at people's homes and things like that. Do people sometimes run games in their home or something? Because is it
Yeah, it's not it's not as common. I do all the time when I can because it just plain cheaper. But people with more traditional houses, especially if they are living with their multiple generation houses, um, traditionally, if you're going to hang out with friends, people always go out to hang out somewhere. They go to a cafe or they go to a restaurant or they go to a tavern for several hours and do all their talking and gabbing and hanging out and lounging there rather than in someone's home. You can actually see a glimpse of that if you watch, anime and this, the school kids are always out. It's not as common that they're at someone's house and just lounging out, but when they do, the mom comes in and she, brings snacks and stuff like that, because it's kind of a little bit big thing when someone comes in. But so if you live in a multi-generation house, it's inconvenient, not just space wise, but in terms of like not bothering the other people in the family to have friends there for 4 to 6 hours gabbing in like the living room or something. So people, for that reason, people tend to get out nowadays. Well, and you notice that you'll see that a lot in the foreign community in Japan, where there's this like half the games seem to be run in cafes and stuff like the Japanese system, especially for people who have smaller apartments. And then other people are just so used to not having to pay to play. In other words, not having to go out and have put money somewhere that they, even if it's inconvenient, out of the way, or the place is kind of cramped, they'll still want to like only do it in apartments and stuff like that. That mindset is also changing again as the geek community that grew up on this stuff in the 80s is getting older and owning their own houses. That's changing a little bit, but still, in areas that don't have a lot of places excuse me, that don't have a lot of space, you'll see people going out more, um, and people that are really, if like for example a gaming couple gets married and they, and then they have a house, then they'll have friends and stuff in their house. Is what I've been seeing.
this is a question about culture because I have run games with international players, some from Mexico, some from uh, Italy, and perhaps other parts of Asia. It's just that sometimes they approach certain problems quite differently, and I think this is also reflected with some of the games that's been translated, isn't it? It's like it's not just like go in, kick the door and kill all the monsters and that sort of thing. I think there is a bit of a different sort of layer there. Like it
Mhm.
seems as if friendship or bond with people is considered as part of an asset. Is it like more of a like Japanese sort of culture things where relation
Yeah,
is quite important?
that's going to be something that's more about that game itself in particular, especially because Double Cross, it wasn't basically amplifying anything that was already there. Double Cross has its own special rules and stuff like that to get that sort of feeling of, having rules for friendships and having rules for burning your friendships away and that sort of thing, that are different from other games. And that also has a really hardcore fan base. Like for a while, it was like number two behind Call of Cthulhu because of the way that it was, the way that people were posting online replays and stuff like that, very intense sessions, and people just really like that sort of thing. But one thing that I have noticed, that's a little bit more interesting in Japan is that there tends to be less inter-party conflict. It's always like even if like you got they grumble at each other as they kick the doors down and stuff like that. There's very little backstabbing or even that sort of like getting in your face sort of play, that you might see at other tables. Like, if sometimes conflict is fun and interesting, and even if you still plan to go through the steps of the adventure, sometimes people will take on their character and really sort of quote unquote get in verbal fights with the other characters. That doesn't happen as much in Japan, I think. I guess it's like a sort of there might be a sociological essay there about conflict adverse society and things like that. Um, but it's just more of like, hey, everyone, as soon as everyone's just sort of has a mindset, I'm making a character. Doesn't matter what their background is, and it doesn't matter if they're a gruff personality or very different from the other characters. I'm still going to play them in a way that it's conceivable that they're just going to like lock arms, be friends, and keep marching together. The people who have read a lot of Tolkien might do some elf versus dwarf grumbling, but for the most part, since that's not really described too heavily in the rule books or in the other books, it's just like, oh, we have just a very diverse, random species, ancestries gathered together and marching through these dungeons. And the other thing is that I noticed is that people will quickly take on very anime-esque personalities when they roleplay. Whether I'm running Dungeons and Dragons or whether I'm running Dungeon World, whether like a very story-focused one versus a very combat-focused one. I've run for strangers and friends and stuff like that. I always notice at the table, men, women, whoever, whatever the mix is, there's always like someone is going to immediately like play like a princess, like a little girl princess, magical or combat type, and with a really bubbly personality, no matter what. Like I for example, one time that convention recently, I did a Dungeon World game, although I've done the same setting in Dungeons and Dragons. It's kind of a very simple setting that's kind of themed like Dark Souls or something like really dark Gothic architecture, really bleak and stuff like that. And everyone coming into the table was like, oh, we all know Bloodborne, Dark Souls. We understand the setting. We're all on board. I'm like, oh, cool. The first thing is like, I'm a bubbly magical girl. And I'm like, and I know this person just spoke about Dark Souls, and they played it, they understand it, they love it, they got it, and all of a sudden we got bubbly girl. I'm like, okay, well, we'll figure this out. And asking questions like that, it actually worked itself out in the setting, but still, very bombastic, anime-esque personalities will emerge, which is kind of cool because it's not just like I roll the dice and walk through the room. People are really getting into the roleplay aspect, really taking on different personalities.
I think something like that happened to me, but in a different way. Because it's more like sometimes I play with people from really different backgrounds. It's like that point of reference for fantasy is really different. Some of them are more into like hardcore sort of fantasy or like Tolkien-esque, and yeah, that's how they tend to react, and they don't know how to react to like perhaps the anime sort of fantasy and all that sort of stuff. And it makes roleplay pretty difficult for all these different people.
Yeah. You'll find that for the most part, the game sort of separates the players, because there's, for example, there's a really strong community of people in Japan, what I'll call like kind of grognard type, like they've been playing since the 80s, and they grew up on Tolkien. They read the Tolkien in Japanese when it first came out in the 70s, and they're really into that. And so they play like games like Rune Quest or Tunnels and Trolls. Yeah, and they're really into into that sort of play. But people that are more into and it's not just there are older people of my in my generation that are playing the newer games too. But there are some people in the older generation that only wants to do like they only want to play like the Traveler, like the classic Traveler. They only want to play the Rune Quest. Part of it is because of the rules. Part of it is because of the seriousness of the setting and stuff like that. But then when you get into like Sword World really doesn't have it has a default setting, but it's not really described like it. There's no real reference points to how do people act and stuff like that. So it can be very lighthearted at times. And so the people that play that, the reference points that they have are not like the old school like Tolkien and stuff like that, or Witcher style stuff. It's more like the anime or light novel stuff, which is kind of wacky, bombastic fantasy characters getting along together in a world with unexplained but high-powered magic, and so silly things can happen. Not that all the games are lighthearted and silly, but it tends to go more that way than everyone being really serious about elven supremacy versus dwarven ancestry and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and just going off a bit on a tangent. I saw on your Twitter feed that you said Dungeon Meshi is going to be animated. Is that right?
Oh yeah, that's correct. I mean, at least I don't have a release date or anything like that, but at least the last 3 Dungeon Meshi manga that I bought all had the obi, the wraparound on it that said what anime kette. It's the anime's solid. Basically the contracts have been signed. It's going to be an anime for sure, which usually means in a few seasons. But I haven't seen any details or or anything like that. So I don't know. Then again, I'm not super huge in anime, so I've been following blogs and stuff like that. But imagine if I dig, I could find out at least what channel it's on or what season it might come out. But it's definitely coming out.
Yeah, I guess it would help to provide a point of reference to Japanese players, I guess.
Yeah, that too. Well, that's the interesting thing is that that manga is crazy popular. Like when it first came out and I heard about it, like I saw like an advertisement for it or something like that.
Have a
Uh,
translated copy of it there. It's
yeah,
called Delicious in Dungeon, which is a really weird English name they
yeah,
picked.
it's a ridiculous title. I hate it, so I never use it. Basically, it's one of like there are occasions when a manga artist will, not knowing any English, will just for like almost like a squiggly decoration, will just like, I'll look up a couple English words. Oh, and then they'll write it, and then when it actually gets for real translated, they're like, oh, that was cute. Yeah, we're gonna just skip that and call it Dungeon Meshi or Dungeon, Dungeon Food. But for some reason, the localization team really botched that and decided that they're going to go with Delicious in Dungeon, which is a horrible name. I just so I call it Dungeon Meshi. Anyway, yeah, I'm not a anime connoisseur or anything like that. I'm it's more on the linguistic angle. It's a linguistic horror show of a choice. But that aside, it's a great manga. And when it first came out, it went through like 5 printings like within a year. It was crazy. In that, if you go to even a small bookstore, like a small local bookstore that has only like 100 manga, they would have it there. Which blew my mind because I mean, fantasy aside, there wasn't there hasn't really been a recent like Lotus War style huge fantasy property, like there's been, well, I mean, Attack on Titan, okay, but Attack on Titan is a little bit something else. It's kind of like a weird horror thing, but nothing like that is a little bit more straight fantasy with elves and magic and stuff like that. Nothing really big. And then I heard about this manga. And I'm like, oh, and I went to the bookstore to find it, and it was like they had this display with none of the manga there, saying stay tuned for second printing. And so the second or third printing, I finally got my hands on it. But basically, they underestimated the amount of casual interest in this manga, and it just flew off the shelves like not at Attack on Titan levels, but in a way that just surprised the hell out of everyone. Everyone, like even people who were like, this manga is awesome. I so want it to succeed. I hope as many people see it as possible. Even they were like, whoa, I don't know what's going on here. My wish it came true a little bit, but this is just a really weird feeling. So it's really cool. And of, in the fan communities, there are people that are making recipe and cooking side rules for Sword World and blah blah. Ryutama, of course, already has stuff like that in it. But and people even make food themed scenarios in Ryutama and stuff like that. But that's also been another force that's been driving people into checking out fantasy.
In Japan, do people usually mix together? I mean, do gaijin players sometimes play in Japanese table or vice versa? Because I do think language is a bit of a barrier sometimes. Do they have their own like sort of event, or how would a person find a
Yeah.
game in Japan?
So it tends to be that the foreigners play with the foreigners and the Japanese play with Japanese. At the game cafe that I frequent, like there's for years I was the only foreigner that would like ever go to these events, um, and only in the last 2 years or so have I regularly seen like two others that have enough Japanese skill. And I mean, it's a weird intersection, right? You have like people that are really into RPGs and who really are good with, um, like who are very into RPGs, who are really good at Japanese, um, and also have the free time to invest in that sort of thing, or have the passion to invest in that sort of thing. It's a it's a kind of a weird mix there. And for the longest time, I was like the only guy. I was the only guy team. Um, uh, but they would go to regular events. I know some. I have some friends that were into it. Like they would only like there's one. I've got another friend who plays with his wife and their friends, but they don't go to other conventions. They don't go to other events and stuff like that. Um, but more recently, there are some foreigners trickling in because it's a little bit easier in these days than it was in my days to learn Japanese to the level where you can actually play. Because that's I mean, it's a huge barrier, especially if you really like games where you act out in character. Um, like uh, again, learning Japanese to the level where you can do that is just really confounding for most people. The first few times I just would like get a headache after 30 minutes of play, and only now can I I've been GMing and playing both in Japanese, but I can do so, and then even afterwards I get a little bit more tired than normal, um, but it's not that big of a deal. But it took a while to get to that level. Meanwhile, on the other side, since more Japanese people grew up learning English from an early age, there are more Japanese people that play in the foreign or the English run games. Um, so yeah, it's kind of more like that. It's separate, but not for any real divisive reason. It's just the simple thing of Japanese is hard, and there's not many people that are comfortable with it at a level where they can really get into it, like at a roleplay level.
Now, being a multilingual person yourself, do you think you think differently in different language? Because I know a lot of people who does that because if they are using some a different language, their personality sometimes like conform to that language. Do you feel
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, like I don't have any solid examples, but for the most part, my default these days is to think in Japanese. I do a lot of work in Japanese during the day. And so when I'm like idly like walking down the road and thinking about something, I mean, I'll be listening to like a podcast or something like that in English. But then like my internal comments to myself will be in Japanese and stuff like that. So, and I noticed that I definitely have, I would say like a personality change or anything like that, but the, my different modes of thinking lead to different, I guess, conclusions and stuff like that.
right? Okay, that's
Yeah.
really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially when I have to think in like swear words and stuff like that, because, uh, uh, yeah, not that's the thing is not really. It's just there's not so much swear words, which is an aspect I love about the English language. There's so many interesting ways to swear. Um, in Japanese, there's not as many interesting ways to swear, but there are more interesting ways to be really insulting to people. Like if you say the word "you," but use the more insulting word for "you" and say it in a certain way and trill your R's and stuff like that, um, then it conveys a level of insult that just isn't it can't be described in English. So that's also very interesting as well.
Do you have a secret sauce for GMing or DMing that you can share with us? What's your secret?
Interesting. Man, I've actually written a lot about that in the game that I translated. My first translation, Tenrybancho Zero, in the rule section, I actually codify a lot of what I do in my games into these chunk-sized bits of advice, and I actually wrote them into the book. So if you go through, if you pick up the PDF of Tenrybancho Zero, you can actually read the rule section. You'll see the section that I built in where I'm basically, here's how I run it. Here's some tips to run it as a player. Here's some tips to run it as a GM. And a lot of stuff is like the universal stuff that I use for any of my games. But I think aside from the one of the main things is just read a lot, read and learn a lot, watch a lot of stuff. The more input you get, whether it's science fiction or fantasy or whatever, the more things you're going to be able to draw on in the game. Um, like there was, um, especially when it comes to things like cyberpunk or future stuff. Since I'm kind of I'm a computer engineer by day, and so I draw a lot on that. Like for example, if someone like makes a hacking roll and I have to describe what I'm doing to do the hack, I can kind of make up fake stuff easier because of things that I've seen at work or just read articles about. Or if if we're playing fantasy and I want to describe like this beautiful temple or something like you come across this really impressive temple, I'll like close my eyes and like I'll start describing the temple, but like in my head I'm like, okay, so this is going to be like the big temple of Vivek in Morrowind, and I'm just like describing what I remember it looks like, So like playing video games and stuff like that, and getting inspired. Feel free to steal that stuff and bring it into your game. The more and stuff that you read in books, you don't have to steal characters or stuff like that, but just like if there's like something you read or see and there's a particular style of speaking or mannerism that this particular person does, that you're like, that's kind of interesting, you might write that down and bring it in some way in the game. Or some sort of building where you look at it, you're like, in a video game, you're like, look, see this building, you're like, that's an awesome building, just bring it in wholesale and into one of your sessions, or stuff like that. So basically, the more experience you have, the more you read, the more video games you play. Just be willing to bring, find stuff to steal, the things that particularly interest you. Just visualize them and bring them into your game, and it makes it, aside from the scenario part and the getting everyone together, just the ability to like bring in a piece of something that means something to you. You'll be able to describe it really cool. The players will react to that. And the session will be a little more interesting. Have those little cornerstones of something cool in them, I think.
And that was Andy Kitkowski from Yokohama, Japan. You can use the links in the description to find his products and website. CJ, over and out.